The steel door slams shut with a sound that echoes through concrete walls. 7 feet by 12 feet. That's the world now. A slab of poured concrete for a bed. A steel toilet bolted to the floor. And 23 hours of absolute silence, broken only by the screams that bounce off reinforced walls when the darkness gets too heavy. ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. America's only federal Supermax prison, where the worst of the worst learn what it truly means to survive. But before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. 340 men live here in 2026, each one locked in near total isolation. Some for years, some for decades. This isn't punishment for a crime on the outside. This is what happens when you're too dangerous for regular maximum security. When you've killed in prison. When you've orchestrated violence from behind bars. When the system decides you can never be allowed to mingle with other human beings again. Travis Dusenbury spent 10 years inside these walls. He describes the first moment of arrival as a feeling that sinks into your bones. Not a highway in the distance. Not even the sky. Just concrete and steel and the knowledge that this is where you'll be for years to come. Maybe forever. The cells are designed for psychological control. Everything is concrete. The bed, the desk, the sink, even the stool you sit on to eat meals pushed through a slot in a solid steel door. A single window, 4 inches wide and 4 feet tall, angled so you can't see the Rocky Mountains that surround the facility. Can't see trees. Can't see grass. Can't see anything that reminds you a world still exists outside these walls. 1 hour outside the cell. That's what the schedule allows. But not outside. You're moved, handcuffed, and shackled to a concrete recreation pen. Former Warden Robert Hood called ADX a clean version of hell. He told CNN that when inmates first arrive and see the beauty of the mountains in the backdrop, that's the last time they'll ever see it. What happens next, he said, is much worse than death. This facility was built in 1994 for $60 million after 2 correctional officers were murdered by Aryan Brotherhood members at USP Marion in Illinois. The Bureau of Prisons needed a place where the most violent, the most dangerous, the most unpredictable inmates could be completely isolated, where they couldn't hurt staff, couldn't kill other inmates, couldn't coordinate violence or escapes. But survival in Supermax isn't just about staying alive. It's about keeping your mind intact when everything is designed to break it. Psychiatrist Stuart Grassian documented what he called SHU Syndrome in 1993. Paranoia, panic attacks, hallucinations, psychotic symptoms. The mind, deprived of stimulation and human contact, begins to fracture. Some inmates have been held in conditions like these for over 20 years. At California's Pelican Bay State Prison, inmates spent decades in 80-square-foot cells, 22.5 hours a day, with no windows, no contact, no hope of release from isolation, until they decided to fight back the only way they could. In July 2013, 30,000 inmates across California went on hunger strike. For 2 months, they refused to eat. Dozens were hospitalized. Some nearly died. They demanded an end to indefinite solitary confinement. They wanted the chance to prove they could change. The chance to be human again. This is the story of what it takes to survive when the system puts you in a place designed to destroy your mind. When every moment is a battle against isolation, against violence, against yourself. When the only way out is through years of proving you're no longer a threat. If you can even remember who you were before the concrete walls closed in. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The descent into isolation. The journey to Supermax doesn't happen overnight. It's earned through blood and decisions that can't be undone. Thomas Silverstein learned this in 1983. He was already serving life without parole at USP Marion in Illinois when he made the choice that would seal his fate forever. On October 22nd, he and another inmate, named Clayton Fountain killed Correctional Officer Merle Klutz. The method was brutal. The motive was revenge. The consequence was something no one in the American prison system had experienced before. Silverstein was placed in what the Bureau of Prisons called no human contact status. For the next 36 years, until his death in 2019, he would live in complete isolation. Not just solitary confinement. Complete isolation. His cell was kept lit 24 hours a day. Guards were instructed to speak to him as little as possible. He was moved from facility to facility, always in the most restrictive housing unit available, until ADX Florence opened in 1994 and became his final home. Former Warden Robert Hood, who ran ADX from 2002 to 2005, said that he'd seen the worst of the worst in his career. But what happened to Silverstein went beyond punishment. It was erasure. Hood described being haunted by what he witnessed. The psychological deterioration. The way human beings break when you remove every element of social contact. The path to Supermax follows patterns. According to Bureau of Prisons data, inmates are transferred to ADX for specific security reasons. Killing staff members. Orchestrating gang violence from inside prison walls. Multiple escape attempts. Leading riots. Being deemed too dangerous to house in general population or even standard maximum security. Richard McNair earned his way there through 3 prison escapes. The last one, in 2006, involved hiding in a mail crate and being loaded onto a truck. He was captured a year and a half later after a routine traffic stop in Canada. The officer's dashboard camera caught the entire interaction. McNair was calm, polite. He nearly talked his way out of it. But when his identity was confirmed, he was sent straight to ADX. Eric Rudolph, the Olympic Park bomber, sits in a cell there too. So does Zacharias Moussaoui, convicted for conspiracy in the September 11th attacks. Ramzi Youssef, who orchestrated the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Theodore Kaczynski spent years there before his transfer and eventual death. These aren't names from the general population. These are individuals deemed so dangerous that contact with any other human being presents an unacceptable risk. But it's not just terrorists and serial killers. Gang leaders make up a significant portion of ADX's population. Members of the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, MS-13. Men who coordinated murders from behind bars in other facilities. Men who turned prison yards into war zones. The Aryan Brotherhood represents less than 1% of the federal prison population, but according to federal prosecutors, they're responsible for 18 to 25% of murders in the federal system. Their presence at USP Marion in the 1980s led directly to the lockdown that preceded ADX's construction. 2 officers dead. Multiple inmates killed in coordinated attacks. The message was clear: traditional maximum security couldn't contain them. The transfer process is methodical. Inmates don't know it's coming until it happens. One morning, guards arrive at the cell. Full restraints, handcuffs, belly chain, leg irons, black box over the handcuffs so fingers can't move. Sometimes a spit hood if the inmate has a history of spitting at staff. The transport van has no windows except for small slits. The drive to ADX from anywhere in the federal system can take days, with stops at transfer centers. During the entire journey, the inmate remains in full restraints. No conversation, no explanation, just the knowledge that wherever they're going is worse than where they've been. Travis Dusenbury described his arrival at ADX in a 2020 interview. He'd been transferred for his involvement in riots at other facilities. The van pulled through multiple security checkpoints. Each gate opened remotely. No guard came close to the vehicle until it was inside the final perimeter. When the door opened, armed guards in tactical gear surrounded the van. No chances, no proximity. Processing takes hours. Strip search, medical evaluation, psychological screening, assignment to arrange. H unit for the highest security. G unit for general population Supermax. D unit for inmates with mental health issues who still need maximum security. The cell assignment is permanent until behavior warrants a change. The door closes. That sound Travis described. Steel on steel. final and absolute. The first night is when reality sets in. There's no one to talk to, no cellmate, no conversation through bars, just concrete walls that absorb every sound except the ones that echo in your own head. The fluorescent lights hum constantly. Sleep comes in fragments if it comes at all. Former inmates describe the initial shock lasting weeks. The human brain isn't designed for this level of isolation. Even prisoners who've spent years in traditional solitary confinement report that Supermax is categorically different. It's not just being alone, it's being erased. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychologist who studied the effects of long-term isolation at Pelican Bay, documented what happens to the mind. Memory loss, inability to concentrate, hypersensitivity to stimuli. Some inmates develop what's called spatial disorientation. They lose the ability to judge distances. Their peripheral vision narrows. When they're eventually released to less restrictive housing, they walk into walls. They can't navigate hallways they've seen 1,000 times. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX is necessary, that these men represent a clear and present danger to staff and other inmates. That isolation is the only tool that works when someone has demonstrated they'll kill given any opportunity. But the question that haunts former wardens and psychologists alike is this: what happens to a human being when you take away everything that makes them human? And if they ever get out, what are you releasing back into the world? The clock on the wall in each cell doesn't tick. It's digital, silent. The seconds change without sound. Time moves differently when there's nothing to mark it except meals pushed through a slot and the hour of recreation in a concrete cage. This is where survival begins. In the silence. In the recognition that this might be forever. In the choice between fighting the system and finding a way to live within it. Some inmates never make that choice. They rage against the walls until their minds break completely. They flood their cells with toilet water. They start fires with whatever materials they can find. They scream until their voices give out. Guards describe it as watching someone self-destruct in slow motion. Others adapt. They create routines. They exercise in the 7 feet of floor space available. They read every book the prison library will send. They write letters to lawyers, to family, to anyone who might still remember they exist. But adaptation in Supermax isn't about getting comfortable. It's about finding a way to keep your mind intact when every environmental factor is working against you. It's about surviving one day at a time, knowing that tomorrow will be exactly the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that, stretching forward into infinity. The question isn't whether you can survive a week or a month. It's whether you can survive years without losing the part of yourself that makes you human. Most can't. The statistics on mental deterioration in long-term isolation are overwhelming. But some do, and their stories reveal something fundamental about human resilience, about the mind's ability to adapt even in the most extreme circumstances. But first, you have to survive the descent. The moment when the door closes and you realize there's no way out. When the walls start to press in and time becomes meaningless. When the only sound is your own breathing and the voice in your head asking if you'll make it through the night. The psychology of confinement. The human mind wasn't built for a concrete box. Evolution designed us for open spaces, for social groups, for constant environmental stimulation. Strip all that away, and the brain starts to malfunction in predictable ways. Dr. Stuart Grassian first documented what happens in 1983 when he studied inmates in solitary confinement at Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts. His findings were so disturbing that courts began using them to challenge isolation practices nationwide. But the prisons kept using solitary anyway, and the symptoms kept appearing. Hyperresponsivity to external stimuli. A guard's footsteps in a hallway become deafening. The fluorescent light hum becomes unbearable. Inmates stuff toilet paper in their ears, trying to block out sounds that wouldn't register in a normal environment. Their nervous systems, starved for input, amplify everything to painful levels. Perceptual distortions follow. Inmates at Pelican Bay reported seeing shadows move when nothing was there. hearing voices through the ventilation system, feeling insects crawling on their skin. One inmate told researchers he could see the molecules in the air vibrating. His brain, desperate for stimulation, was manufacturing experiences that didn't exist. Todd Ashker spent 28 years in Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit. 28 years in an 80-square-foot cell with no windows, no human contact, no physical touch except when guards restrained him. He described the hallucinations as invasive. Not quite real, but impossible to dismiss. The mind playing tricks that felt like reality breaking down. Panic attacks become routine. The walls feel like they're closing in because, psychologically, they are. The brain's spatial awareness centers malfunction. Inmates describe crushing pressure in their chests, inability to breathe, racing heart, all the physical symptoms of mortal danger despite sitting alone in a locked cell. Time perception fractures. Days blend together. Hours feel like minutes, or minutes feel like hours. Former inmates report losing chunks of time. They'll sit down to eat breakfast, and suddenly it's dinner. Or they'll lie down for what feels like a few minutes and realize 8 hours have passed. The brain's internal clock, regulated by environmental cues and social interaction, stops working properly. Memory deterioration starts within months. Names become hard to recall. Simple words disappear mid-sentence. Long-term memories from before incarceration grow fuzzy, while recent events vanish completely. Dr. Craig Haney's research at Pelican Bay found that 70% of inmates in long-term isolation reported significant memory problems. But the most devastating symptom is what researchers call loss of stimulus hunger. The desire for new experiences simply dies. Inmates stop reading, stop exercising, stop engaging with the few activities available. They lie on their concrete beds, staring at walls for 20 hours a day. Not depressed exactly, just emptied of the fundamental human drive to seek novelty. Anthony Graves spent 18 years on Texas death row, much of it in isolation, before being exonerated in 2010. He described becoming so accustomed to his cell that leaving it for appeals hearings felt traumatic. The courtroom was too bright, too loud, too full of people. He wanted to go back to his cell, back to the predictable misery he understood. The phenomenon is called institutionalization, but in Supermax it happens faster and cuts deeper. The isolation doesn't just make you dependent on routine. It makes you incapable of functioning outside it. At ADX Florence, mental health staff conduct regular evaluations. They're required to. Federal policy mandates mental health screening for inmates in isolation. But the screening happens through the cell door. A psychologist stands in the hallway asking questions through a food slot. The inmate answers from inside. No face-to-face contact. No ability to assess body language or affect beyond what's visible through a 4-inch opening. Former ADX psychologist Dr. Raymond Salekin told reporters the limitations were profound. How do you assess someone's mental state when you can't even enter the room they're in? How do you build therapeutic rapport through a slot in a steel door? The answer is you can't. You document symptoms. You prescribe medication. But actual treatment requires human connection, which is exactly what Supermax denies. Medication use is pervasive. Bureau of Prisons data shows that inmates in restrictive housing are far more likely to be on psychotropic drugs than general population prisoners. Antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, chemical restraints when physical isolation isn't enough. But medication can't fix what isolation breaks. You can't medicate someone out of hallucinations caused by sensory deprivation. You can't prescribe away the panic attacks triggered by concrete walls. The symptoms are rational responses to irrational conditions. Some inmates develop what guards call cell rage, sudden explosive violence directed at themselves or anyone within reach. Inmates bang their heads against concrete walls until their skulls crack. They swallow razors. They set fires in their cells with whatever combustible materials they can find. Paper, bedding, their own clothing. The fires are particularly common. Multiple sources describe inmates at various Supermax facilities starting fires weekly. The sprinkler system floods the cell. The inmate gets charged with destruction of property, gets more time added to their isolation term. But for a few minutes there is chaos. Movement. Guards responding. Something different than the crushing sameness of every other day. Self-mutilation follows predictable patterns, cutting with whatever sharp objects can be fashioned or hidden. Biting. Scratching. One psychiatrist who worked in Supermax facilities described an inmate who systematically removed his own eye with a makeshift tool. Not in a moment of psychotic rage. Deliberately. Over hours. Because he wanted to force a medical transfer. Wanted to be somewhere, anywhere other than that cell. The guards see it all. They're the ones who find the bodies after successful suicides, who respond to medical emergencies when inmates stop eating or start seizing, who have to enter cells after fires or floods to restrain inmates who've lost control. Former ADX Correctional Officer James Davidson told interviewers the job changes you. You become desensitized to suffering because you see it constantly. An inmate screaming in his cell is just background noise. Someone flooding their toilet is an administrative problem, not a mental health crisis. You have to distance yourself emotionally to survive the job. But that distance creates its own problems. When guards stop seeing inmates as human, abuse becomes easier to justify or to overlook. Complaints about excessive force in Supermax facilities are common. Allegations of guards deliberately antagonizing mentally ill inmates, withholding medical care, using chemical agents in enclosed cells where inmates can't escape the spray. A 2012 lawsuit against Pelican Bay detailed conditions in the security housing unit. Inmates kept in concrete boxes for decades, some for 20 years or more without any sustained human contact. No phone calls, no contact visits. Mail heavily restricted. The lawsuit argued that indefinite solitary confinement constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. The case dragged through courts for years while 30,000 California inmates went on hunger strike in 2013. They refused food for 60 days. Some lost 50 pounds. Several were hospitalized. They demanded an end to indefinite isolation. They wanted the chance to earn their way out of the SHU through good behavior. The state initially refused, argued that gang members in isolation were still coordinating violence, still running their organizations from behind solid steel doors, that any reduction in security would lead to deaths. But the hunger strike forced negotiations. In 2015, California agreed to reforms. Inmates could no longer be held in isolation based solely on gang affiliation. They had to commit actual rule violations to stay in the SHU. And there had to be a pathway out, a way to demonstrate they were no longer a threat. Hundreds of inmates who'd spent decades in isolation were released to general population. Some adjusted, some didn't. Guards reported inmates walking into walls, covering their ears in the dining hall, having panic attacks when other prisoners came too close. At ADX Florence, the pathway out exists in theory. The step-down program is designed to gradually reintegrate inmates who demonstrate sustained good behavior, move from H unit to G unit, eventually to a less restrictive facility. But the process takes years and depends on correctional staff discretion. Travis Dusenbury spent 10 years at ADX before being transferred out in 2018. He described the step-down program as arbitrary, subjective. Guard could deny your progress for any reason. A dirty cell, talking back, being late to return a food tray. Each infraction reset the clock. When he was finally transferred to a medium security facility, the sensory overload was overwhelming. People everywhere. Noise. Movement. Colors besides gray and orange. He spent his first week in general population hiding in his cell. The freedom was terrifying. The psychological damage from years of isolation doesn't disappear when the isolation ends. Studies show former isolated inmates have higher rates of PTSD, chronic depression, and social anxiety than prisoners who serve time in general population. Their brains were rewired by trauma. Adaptation to isolation becomes maladaptation to normal life. But some inmates have no choice except to adapt to Supermax permanently. Their crimes or their behavior guarantee they'll never leave. For them, survival isn't about getting out. It's about finding a way to live inside a system designed to destroy the mind. The question becomes, how do you stay sane in a place built to drive you insane? How do you maintain your humanity when everything human is stripped away? The answers are as varied as the inmates themselves. Some find religion. Some retreat into fantasy worlds constructed entirely in their heads. Some exercise obsessively, using physical exhaustion to quiet mental anguish. And some simply endure, day after day, year after year, waiting for something to change while knowing it probably never will. Codes, hierarchies, and invisible wars. The assumption about Supermax is that isolation eliminates violence. No contact means no conflict, but the reality is far more complex. Violence doesn't disappear in maximum security. It evolves. Even in ADX Florence, where inmates spend 23 hours alone in concrete cells, gang structures remain intact. Orders still flow. Debts are still collected. Wars that started in other prisons continue through whispered conversations during the 1 hour of recreation, through coded letters that pass staff inspection, through a communication system so sophisticated it operates despite every security measure designed to stop it. The Mexican Mafia, known as La IM, pioneered prison communication techniques in California's system during the 1970s. By the time key members landed in Supermax facilities, those techniques had evolved into an art form. Kites, notes written in miniature handwriting on tiny scraps of paper, could be passed between cells through ventilation systems, under door gaps, or during the brief moments when inmates crossed paths during transfers. Former FBI gang investigator Robert Walker described the Mexican Mafia's prison network as more organized than some corporations. Shot callers in isolation could order hits in county jails 3 states away. Money moved through underground banking systems involving inmates' families on the outside. Drugs flowed into prisons through corrupt staff or sophisticated smuggling operations coordinated from solitary confinement cells. At Pelican Bay in the 1990s, the violence reached critical levels. The security housing unit was supposed to neutralize gang leadership. Instead, it concentrated power. With the most influential shot callers isolated together, they had time to strategize, to plan, to build alliances or wage wars without the distractions of general population. In 1997, a race war erupted across California prisons. Black inmates versus Hispanic inmates. The conflict had been building for years over drug, trafficking territories, and power dynamics. When it finally ignited, guards found themselves unable to stop the cascade of violence. Stabbings in yard after yard, bodies piling up. The orders came from the SHU, from inmates who hadn't seen a prison yard in years but still commanded absolute loyalty. Federal prosecutors later revealed that gang leaders in isolation had orchestrated the entire conflict through coded letters and messages passed during attorney visits. The Aryan Brotherhood operates similarly. Despite representing a tiny fraction of the prison population, their influence extends throughout the federal system. At ADX, several high-ranking AB members serve their sentences in complete isolation. But isolation doesn't equal powerlessness. Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham, 2 of the AB's most notorious leaders, spent decades at ADX. Both died there, Mills in 2018, Bingham in 2023. But during their years in Supermax, they maintained control of AB operations nationwide. Federal indictments detailed how they approved murders, settled disputes, and collected protection money from behind solid steel doors. The communication methods are ingenious. Some inmates develop codes based on book pages and line numbers. A letter referencing specific passages would contain hidden messages when decoded. Others use chess moves written in correspondence to convey orders. The Bureau of Prisons monitors mail, but monitoring requires recognizing the code first. Attorney-client privilege creates another vulnerability. Visits with lawyers are confidential. While physical contact isn't allowed and conversations may be recorded in terrorism cases, documents can be exchanged. Some gang members exploited this by having associates pose as paralegals or legal assistants to pass messages. The violence in Supermax, when it occurs, is often self-directed or aimed at staff. Inmates can't reach each other, so they hurt themselves or anyone who enters their cell. Correctional officers' safety in these facilities depends on strict protocols. Never enter a cell alone. Always have backup. Maintain distance during any interaction. But protocols don't prevent all incidents. In 2008, an inmate at ADX Florence attacked guards during a routine cell check. He'd fashioned a weapon from a plastic toothbrush sharpened against the concrete floor. The attack left one officer seriously injured before the inmate was restrained with chemical agents. The weapons in Supermax are primitive but effective. Anything with an edge can be sharpened. Plastic utensils, pieces of broken mirror, metal strips peeled from bed frames. Inmates have time, endless time, to work materials into lethal instruments. And they have motivation. Some want to hurt staff. Others want to force a transfer. Some just want to feel powerful in an environment designed to render them powerless. The hierarchy within Supermax facilities is informal but absolute. Inmates convicted of certain crimes, particularly crimes against children, are considered the lowest tier even in isolation. While they're physically separated from general population, information travels. Other inmates know who they are and why they're there. Jared Fogle, the former Subway spokesman convicted of child exploitation crimes, was sent to a federal prison in Colorado. Within months, another inmate attacked him in the recreation yard. He wasn't in Supermax, but the incident illustrates how prison justice works even in high-security settings. There are codes. Violations have consequences. At ADX, the segregation prevents physical violence based on crime type, but the judgment remains. Some inmates refuse to acknowledge certain others during their 1 hour of recreation. The silent treatment might seem trivial, but in an environment where human contact is already minimal, being shunned by the few people you might interact with compounds the isolation. Religious extremists form another distinct group in Supermax. Individuals convicted of terrorism-related offenses often end up at ADX. Ramzi Youssef, Zacharias Moussaoui, Richard Reed, Jakar Sarnaev. They exist in isolation not just for their crimes, but because the government considers them ongoing threats to national security. These inmates have additional restrictions beyond standard Supermax protocols. Special administrative measures can limit their communication even further. No phone calls, no contact visits, all mail screened by intelligence agencies. The fear is that they'll use any communication channel to coordinate attacks or radicalize others. But even SAMs have vulnerabilities. In 2019, prosecutors charge a lawyer with passing messages between her client, Omar Abdulrahman, the blind sheik convicted in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and his followers in Egypt. She allegedly read statements from him during press conferences, violating SAMs that prohibited her from conveying his messages to the media or third parties. The incident revealed how determined individuals can subvert even the most restrictive security measures. It also demonstrated why the government insists on Supermax facilities like ADX. Where else can you hold someone so dangerous that their words alone might inspire violence? For gang members, terrorism convicts, and organized crime figures, Supermax is both punishment and strategic necessity. The isolation protects them from rivals while preventing them from directly controlling criminal enterprises. But it's an imperfect solution. Daniel Lewis Lee was executed in 2020 for murdering a family, including an 8-year-old girl. He spent years on death row at the federal prison complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, under conditions similar to Supermax. His execution was controversial. Some argued life in permanent isolation was worse than death. His own appeals emphasized the brutality of decades in solitary confinement. The death penalty debate intersects with Supermax philosophy. If you can hold someone in conditions so severe they might prefer death, what's the purpose of execution? States like California that have moratoriums on the death penalty still maintain Supermax facilities. Life without parole and isolation becomes the functional equivalent of a death sentence, just slower. Tommy Silverstein, the inmate who killed a guard in 1983, spent 36 years in isolation before dying of heart complications in 2019. He never saw a prison yard again after that day in October. Never had a contact visit with family. Never touched another human being except during restraint procedures. His death came not from execution, but from decades of existing in a concrete box. The question that haunts the Supermax system is whether this level of isolation serves justice or exceeds it. Courts have generally upheld the practice, ruling that isolation doesn't constitute cruel and unusual punishment when applied to inmates who pose ongoing security threats. But the line between security and torture remains contested. For inmates in these facilities, the invisible wars continue regardless of court opinions. Gang affiliations persist. Codes of conduct remain in force. Status hierarchies endure despite physical separation. The concrete walls isolate bodies, but can't completely sever the social bonds and enmities that define prison culture. Survival means navigating these invisible structures carefully, showing respect to those who command it, avoiding disrespect that could have consequences down the line. Because even in Supermax, even in complete isolation, your reputation matters. The system can isolate your body, but it can't isolate your name. And in prison, your name is everything. It's your protection, your currency, your identity when everything else has been stripped away. Protecting it might be the only control you have left. Adaptation and mental fortitude. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable. Even in conditions designed to break the mind, some inmates find ways not just to survive, but to maintain their sanity. The methods vary. The determination doesn't. Robert Hood, the former ADX warden who called the facility a clean version of hell, observed something unexpected during his tenure. Some inmates thrived in isolation, not in the sense of being happy or comfortable, but in developing routines and mental disciplines that kept them functional while others deteriorated. These weren't necessarily the inmates you'd expect. Educational background didn't predict resilience. Neither did age or crime type. What mattered was the ability to create structure in an environment designed to be structureless. To find purpose when purpose had been systematically eliminated. Terry Nichols, convicted for his role in the Oklahoma City bombing, spent years at ADX Florence. Unlike many inmates who descended into mental illness, Nichols maintained his cognitive function through obsessive routine. He exercised at the same time every day, read on a fixed schedule, wrote letters to family members with mechanical regularity. The routine became his anchor. Former inmates described the importance of small rituals, making your bed a certain way every morning, organizing your few possessions in precise arrangements, exercising in a specific order. These actions might seem trivial, but they provide what psychologists call perceived control. Even if you can't control anything meaningful about your situation, you can control how you fold your towel. Physical exercise serves multiple purposes beyond fitness. It structures time, provides goals, releases endorphins that combat depression. Some inmates develop workout routines that would impress professional athletes. Thousands of push-ups and sit-ups daily. Yoga poses held for extended periods. Bodyweight exercises performed in the 7 feet of available floor space. Luis Rodriguez spent 12 years in California's Pelican Bay SHU before his release in 2015. He described exercise as survival. When the walls closed in and panic threatened to overwhelm him, he dropped and did push-ups until his muscles failed. The physical exhaustion quieted the mental chaos, gave him something to focus on besides the concrete box. Reading provides another escape. Prison libraries at facilities like ADX have limited selections, but they'll send books to inmates who request them. Some prisoners read voraciously, hundreds of books a year. Fiction offers temporary escape into other worlds. Nonfiction provides intellectual stimulation that isolation otherwise denies. Thomas Silverstein, despite spending 36 years in near total isolation, taught himself to paint. His artwork became his form of communication with the outside world. Paintings sold through intermediaries. Some pieces went for thousands of dollars. The money meant little. He had nowhere to spend it, but the act of creation gave meaning to otherwise empty days. Art in Supermax takes unconventional forms. With limited materials, inmates improvise. Drawings made with pencil on paper torn from legal pads. Sculptures fashioned from toilet paper and toothpaste formed into paste. One inmate at ADX created intricate origami from magazine pages, folding tiny creatures that demonstrated extraordinary patience and focus. Writing serves similar functions. Some inmates journal obsessively, documenting every day despite the sameness. Others write letters to family, to lawyers, to journalists, to anyone who might read their words and remember they exist. The act of writing imposes order, creates narrative, asserts that your life has meaning even when external circumstances suggest otherwise. Legal work consumes many inmates. Filing appeals. Researching case law in the prison law library access provided weekly. Drafting motions. Even inmates with no realistic chance of release pour hours into legal documents. The work provides purpose, maintains hope, keeps the mind engaged with complex problems. But legal work in Supermax faces unique obstacles. Access to law libraries is limited to specific hours. Research materials arrive weeks after requests. Attorney consultations happen through video screens or phone calls rather than in-person meetings. Building a meaningful legal defense from isolation requires extraordinary persistence. Religious practice offers solace for some. Muslims pray 5 times daily, orienting themselves toward Mecca in cells designed without clear directional markers. Christians read scripture and pray. Some facilities allow religious services broadcast on closed-circuit television, though many inmates report that watching services on a screen feels hollow compared to communal worship. Carlos Rivas spent 8 years at ADX before transfer to a less restrictive facility. He credited his conversion to Christianity with keeping him alive. Prayer gave structure to his days. Bible study provided intellectual engagement. The belief that his suffering had spiritual purpose made it bearable when nothing else did. But faith doesn't protect everyone. Some inmates lose their religion in isolation. The existential questions become too heavy. If God exists, why this? If there's meaning to suffering, what could possibly justify decades in a concrete box? The crisis of faith compounds the psychological trauma. Meditation practices help some inmates manage anxiety and panic. Breathing exercises, mindfulness techniques. Some learn these from books. Others from fellow inmates who share techniques during their brief recreation periods. The ability to quiet racing thoughts and focus on the present moment becomes crucial when past and future offer only despair. Communication, even limited communication, provides lifelines. Phone calls are restricted at ADX, usually once a month, heavily monitored, 15 minutes maximum. But hearing a family member's voice reminds you that a world exists beyond concrete walls, that someone remembers you, that you haven't been completely erased. Letters serve the same function. Mail call becomes the highlight of existence. A letter from anyone, family, friend, pen pal, advocacy organization, proves you're not forgotten. Some inmates maintain correspondence with people they've never met, strangers who write to prisoners through various programs. The content matters less than the contact. Travis Dusenbury described the devastating impact of having no one on the outside. Inmates whose families abandon them deteriorate faster than those who maintain connections. Without external validation of their existence, they begin to question whether they're real, whether they matter, whether continuing to survive serves any purpose. The step-down program at ADX offers a potential pathway to less restrictive housing, but qualifying requires sustained good behavior measured over years. Note disciplinary infractions, compliance with all rules, positive reports from correctional staff. For inmates serving life sentences, the motivation to comply isn't release. It's the possibility of slightly less brutal conditions. Each step down represents incremental improvements. Moving from H unit to G unit might mean an extra hour of recreation weekly. Eventually, transfer to a medium security facility could mean contact visits, access to a real prison yard, the ability to touch family members for the first time in years. But the step-down program is subjective. Officers have discretion to deny progress for minor infractions. A disrespectful comment, slow compliance with orders, suspicion of rule violations even without proof. Some inmates spend additional years in Supermax for infractions that would earn days in segregation at other facilities. The arbitrariness breeds resentment and hopelessness. When you can't see clear cause and effect between behavior and consequences, maintaining motivation becomes nearly impossible. Why bother following rules meticulously when outcomes seem random? Some inmates develop what researchers call radical acceptance. Not happiness with their situation, but acknowledgement that this is their reality and fighting it mentally only increases suffering. They stop hoping for release or transfer and instead focus on surviving today. Tomorrow can worry about itself. This acceptance isn't giving up exactly. It's a cognitive shift that reduces the psychological burden of constantly wishing things were different. The walls won't change. The isolation won't end. But you can change how you relate to those facts. You can choose to exist in this moment rather than torturing yourself with what was or what might have been. Dr. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote about finding meaning in suffering. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, circulates in many prison libraries. Inmates report that his ideas resonate, that his concept of choosing your attitude even when you can't choose your circumstances provides a framework for endurance. But not everyone can make that choice. Mental illness doesn't respond to philosophy. Psychosis doesn't care about cognitive reframing. For inmates whose minds are fracturing, no amount of routine or discipline or acceptance can stem the deterioration. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX houses only inmates who can function in isolation, that those with serious mental illness are transferred to medical facilities. But former staff and advocacy organizations dispute this. They point to inmates who spend years in ADX despite obvious psychiatric symptoms, who deteriorate visibly while receiving minimal treatment. The line between adaptation and survival becomes blurred. An inmate who sits motionless for 20 hours a day might appear compliant and well-adjusted, or they might be catatonic. The distinction matters, but from outside the cell, it can be impossible to tell. What's clear is that Supermax survival requires more than physical endurance. It demands extraordinary mental discipline, the ability to create meaning where none exists. To maintain hope without evidence, it's warranted. To preserve your sense of self when every aspect of your environment is designed to erase it. Some inmates succeed. They emerge from years of isolation damaged, but intact, capable of returning to less restrictive housing, able to rebuild relationships with family, determined to ensure that the years in concrete didn't steal everything that made them human. Others fail. They're transferred to psychiatric facilities, or they die in isolation, either from suicide or from the physical toll of decades without sunlight, without exercise space, without human touch. The difference between those outcomes often comes down to things outside anyone's control: brain chemistry, family support, random assignment to correctional officers who see you as human versus those who see you as a problem to be managed. But within the narrow space of what inmates can control, the ones who survive are the ones who refuse to let the system define their entire existence, who find ways to live with purpose even in a purposeless environment, who adapt without surrendering completely. It's not inspiration. It's not redemption. It's just the stubborn insistence on remaining human when everything tells you to give up. The guard's perspective. The cell door is 4 inches of solid steel. Between you and the inmate is a barrier designed to stop bullets. But you can still feel the tension radiating through that metal. The awareness that on the other side is someone who's killed before and might kill again given any opportunity. Working in Supermax changes people. It has to. You can't spend 40 hours a week in an environment of concentrated violence and human suffering without it affecting how you see the world. James Davidson worked at ADX Florence for 8 years before transferring to a medium security facility. He described the job as psychologically exhausting in ways civilians can't comprehend. Every interaction is a potential threat. Every cell check could turn into a life-or-death situation. The hypervigilance required becomes automatic, and it follows you home. Correctional officers at facilities like ADX undergo specialized training. How to approach cells safely. How to recognize signs of impending violence. How to use chemical agents in confined spaces. How to extract an uncooperative inmate from a cell using mechanical advantage and team coordination. The training emphasizes that these aren't normal prisoners. These are individuals who've proven they'll kill staff if given the chance. The 4 officers murdered at federal prisons between 1983 and 1985, the incidents that led to ADX's creation, remain part of institutional memory. Their names are invoked during training. Their deaths serve as constant reminders of what happens when you get complacent. When you assume an inmate is manageable because they've been compliant for months. Thomas Silverstein killed Officer Merle Klutz with a weapon that had been smuggled to him by another inmate. The attack was planned, coordinated, executed with brutal efficiency. Klutz had been working corrections for years. He followed protocols, but protocols couldn't save him when an organized hit was sanctioned by the Aryan Brotherhood. After Klutz's death and the subsequent killing of Officer Robert Hoffman by another AB member, the federal prison system had to confront reality. Traditional maximum security couldn't contain the most violent organized criminals. So they built ADX, and they created a new category of correctional officer to staff it. The psychological profile sought for Supermax staff emphasizes emotional control, the ability to remain calm under pressure, judgment that doesn't waver in crisis situations. But they're also looking for people who can maintain professional distance, who won't develop either sympathy or hatred for inmates. Both emotions compromise security. Forming attachments to inmates is explicitly discouraged. An inmate who seems reasonable, who engages in polite conversation during cell checks, who appears reformed, that inmate might be manipulating you. Building rapport to exploit later. Testing boundaries to find weaknesses. Everything is suspect, but the opposite extreme, viewing inmates as subhuman threats, creates its own problems. Dehumanization makes abuse easier to justify. And abuse, even of violent criminals, violates policy and law. Officers who cross that line face termination and sometimes criminal charges. The lawsuits against Pelican Bay in the 2000s detailed allegations of excessive force. Inmates claimed guards deliberately instigated confrontations, used chemical agents when verbal de-escalation would have worked, applied restraints more forcefully than necessary. The state settled for millions of dollars and implemented reforms. At ADX, oversight is constant. Cameras monitor most interactions. Supervisors review use of force reports. The facility operates under intense scrutiny precisely because it houses such high-profile inmates. Any allegation of mistreatment gets investigated by multiple agencies. But cameras don't capture everything. The tone of voice used during a cell check. The deliberate slowness in responding to a medical complaint. The small ways staff can make an inmate's already miserable existence worse without overtly violating rules. Former inmates describe this psychological warfare as worse than physical abuse. Correctional Officer Robert Johnson, who worked in various maximum security facilities for 15 years, told researchers that the job attracts 2 types of people: those who genuinely want to maintain order and safety, and those who enjoy having power over others. The first type usually burns out within a few years. The second type tends to stay, and that creates a concerning dynamic. The burnout rate for Supermax correctional staff is significantly higher than for officers in general population facilities. The constant tension, the lack of normal human interaction, the knowledge that you're surrounded by people who would kill you if they could. It accumulates psychologically. Post-traumatic stress is common among correctional officers, though rarely acknowledged. Guards who've been assaulted, who found inmates who've committed suicide, who responded to cell fires or medical emergencies in crisis situations. They carry those experiences without the support systems available to police or military personnel. The culture discourages showing weakness. You don't talk about nightmares. You don't mention that you flinch when someone approaches from behind. You don't admit that you're drinking more than you used to or that your marriage is failing because you can't turn off the hypervigilance when you get home. Davidson described leaving ADX as leaving a war zone. The first few months at the medium security facility felt almost boring. Inmates moved around, talked to each other, showed normal human behaviors. It took him months to stop expecting every interaction to turn violent. But some officers thrive in Supermax environments. They prefer the structure, the clear protocols, the absence of the social dynamics that complicate general population management. When every inmate is isolated, there's no politics between housing units, no managing relationships between rival gang members in the same pod. The relationship between correctional staff and inmates in Supermax is paradoxical. Officers see inmates at their absolute worst, mentally deteriorating, acting out violently, descending into psychosis. But they also see them daily for years. You learn their patterns, their triggers, what calms them down and what sets them off. Some officers develop a kind of professional respect for inmates who follow rules and don't create problems. These aren't friendships, aren't relationships, but there's an acknowledgement that compliance makes everyone's job easier and the environment safer. The step-down program requires correctional officer input. When an inmate is being evaluated for transfer to less restrictive housing, staff submit reports on behavior. Those reports carry substantial weight in the decision. An officer who doesn't like an inmate can effectively block their progress with negative documentation. This creates a power dynamic that's nearly absolute. Inmates understand that their future depends partly on how guards perceive them. One confrontation, one moment of disrespect, one perceived slight. It can mean years more in Supermax. Former officer Sandra Williams worked at ADX for 6 years before transferring. She described the ethical burden of that power. Knowing that your assessment, which might be influenced by your mood that day, by what the inmate said yesterday, by biases you're not consciously aware of, determines whether someone spends another year in isolation or moves toward less restrictive conditions. The best officers, according to facility administrators, are those who can maintain consistent professional standards regardless of personal feelings, who document behavior objectively, who apply rules uniformly without favoritism or vendetta. But humans aren't designed for perfect objectivity, especially humans working in high-stress environments with individuals convicted of horrific crimes. Some inmates deliberately antagonize officers. Verbal abuse during cell checks, throwing waste through feeding slots, flooding cells to create work. The provocations are calculated, either to get a reaction that can be documented as staff misconduct or simply to exert some control in an environment where they have none. Training emphasizes not taking the bait. An inmate calls you names, you don't respond. An inmate makes threats, you document and continue your rounds. An inmate tries to manipulate you emotionally, you maintain professional boundaries. In theory, it's straightforward. In practice, after the 100th time someone screams obscenities while you're just trying to do your job, maintaining composure requires extraordinary discipline. The physical danger is constant, but mostly unrealized. Incidents happen, but they're rare relative to the number of daily interactions. The psychological toll of constant potential threat is harder to measure, but possibly more damaging than actual violence. Officers at ADX carry no firearms. Guns in a facility full of desperate inmates create more risk than they mitigate. Instead, they rely on radios for backup, chemical agents for extreme situations, and the physical plan itself. The architecture provides safety, remote control doors, reinforced barriers, separation between inmates and staff during all routine operations. Cell extractions, removing an uncooperative inmate from their cell, require 5-person teams. Full protective gear. Shields. A calculated approach designed to minimize injury to everyone involved. The inmate is given multiple opportunities to comply before force is used. Every extraction is videotaped. Every use of force documented in detail. Most extractions end without serious injury. The inmate recognizes they can't win against 5 trained officers and surrenders. But some fight anyway, out of rage or desperation or simple refusal to submit. Those incidents can turn brutal quickly despite all the protocols designed to prevent it. The aftermath of violent incidents affects staff profoundly. An officer who's been assaulted often requests transfer. The ones who stay sometimes become harder, less sympathetic, more likely to view all inmates as threats rather than individuals. The trauma calcifies into defensive emotional barriers. But there's another side rarely discussed. The officers who witness inmates' mental deterioration over years, who watch someone arrive at ADX functional and leave broken, who see the suicide attempts, who respond to medical emergencies when isolation-induced stress triggers heart attacks or strokes in relatively young men. Some officers question whether what they're participating in is ethical, whether permanent isolation serves legitimate penological purposes or crosses into torture. Those questions don't have comfortable answers. The job continues regardless. Warden Robert Hood left ADX and became a vocal critic of long-term isolation. He argued that what he witnessed there exceeded what he could morally justify, that the psychological damage inflicted on inmates, however dangerous they were, constituted cruel and unusual punishment. His statements were controversial among correctional professionals. Many felt he'd betrayed the mission. But Hood's concerns reflect a broader debate within corrections. If the goal is public safety, Supermax achieves it. These facilities prevent dangerous inmates from harming staff or other prisoners. But if the goal includes eventual reintegration or basic human dignity or avoiding practices that most Americans would consider torture if applied to enemy combatants, then Supermax becomes harder to defend. The officers working these facilities mostly don't engage with philosophical debates. They focus on getting through shifts safely, on maintaining order, on going home to their families. The bigger questions about justice and humanity and the purpose of punishment, those belong to policymakers and ethicists. But the guards live with the consequences of those policies every day. They're the ones implementing a system that takes human beings and places them in conditions designed to break them. They're the ones who see the results up close. And they're the ones who have to decide how to live with what they've witnessed. The cost of control. The numbers tell part of the story. ADX Florence costs approximately $78,000 per inmate annually. That's 3 times the cost of housing someone in general population. Multiply that by 340 inmates over 3 decades, and you're looking at billions of dollars invested in isolation. But the real cost can't be measured in budgets. In 2016, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture concluded that solitary confinement exceeding 15 days constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. By that standard, every inmate at ADX, some held in isolation for decades, is being subjected to what international law considers torture. The United States hasn't changed its policies based on UN findings. The government's position remains that Supermax isolation is a necessary security measure, not punishment. That these facilities protect staff and other inmates from individuals who've proven they'll commit violence given any opportunity. Khalif Browder's story illuminated the broader crisis in American corrections, though his case involved pretrial detention rather than Supermax. Browder spent 3 years in solitary confinement at Rikers Island as a teenager awaiting trial for allegedly stealing a backpack. The charges were eventually dismissed. 2 years after his release, he committed suicide. His family and advocates directly attributed his death to the psychological damage from isolation. The difference between Browder and ADX inmates is that Browder was legally innocent. ADX houses convicted felons, many guilty of horrific crimes. But the psychological mechanisms of isolation don't distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. The damage occurs regardless of whether it's deserved. Albert Woodfix spent 43 years in solitary confinement in Louisiana, longer than anyone in American history. He was convicted of killing a prison guard in 1972, though he maintained his innocence throughout. His conviction was overturned multiple times due to procedural violations, but Louisiana kept him in isolation regardless. When he was finally released in 2016 at age 69, he described the experience as designed to destroy the human spirit. Woodfix's case raised questions that extend beyond guilt or innocence. Even if he had killed the guard, even if the worst allegations were true, does that justify 4 decades of near-total isolation? At what point does the punishment exceed the crime by any rational calculus? The debate intersects with America's broader struggle over mass incarceration. The United States holds more people in prison than any other nation, over 2 million as of 2026. Within that population, approximately 80,000 are held in some form of restrictive housing on any given day. Supermax facilities like ADX represent the extreme end of a spectrum that affects tens of thousands. Reform efforts have gained momentum in recent years. States like Colorado, New York, and California have reduced their use of long-term isolation. The changes followed lawsuits, hunger strikes, and mounting evidence of psychological harm. Mississippi closed its Supermax facility entirely in 2010 and reported that violence actually decreased after moving former Supermax inmates to less restrictive settings. But federal facilities operate under different rules. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX remains necessary for national security and institutional safety. The facility houses terrorists, spies, gang leaders, and inmates with histories of killing in prison. No one has proposed a viable alternative for managing these individuals. Travis Dusenbury was released from ADX in 2018 after 10 years. His transfer to medium security marked the beginning of his reintegration, though he described the process as traumatic. Colors overwhelmed him. Conversations confused him. The presence of other people triggered panic attacks. It took months to relearn basic social interaction. In a 2020 interview, Dusenbury reflected on what isolation had taken from him. A decade of his life spent in a concrete box. Relationships severed. Mental health damaged in ways that might never fully heal. But he also acknowledged his own responsibility for the actions that led him there. The riots he participated in, the violence he committed, the choices that warranted extreme security measures. That duality runs through every conversation about Supermax. These inmates aren't innocent. They're not victims of mistaken identity or procedural errors. They earned their way to maximum security through documented violence. The question isn't whether they should face consequences. It's whether permanent isolation is a consequence we should be willing to impose. Some former inmates successfully reintegrate. They're transferred to less restrictive facilities, eventually released, and rebuild their lives. They speak at criminal justice reform conferences, write memoirs, become advocates for changing the system that held them. Others never recover. They're transferred to psychiatric facilities, where they remain in Supermax until they die. Thomas Silverstein's death in 2019 marked the end of the longest period of isolation in federal custody, 36 years. He was 77 years old. He'd spent more than half his life in near-complete isolation for killing a guard in 1983. The calculus of deterrence remains unclear. Does knowing that Supermax exists prevent violence in other prisons? Does the threat of indefinite isolation influence inmate behavior? The research is mixed. Some studies suggest that removing the most violent individuals from general population reduces overall violence. Others find no significant effect. What's certain is that once someone is sent to Supermax, getting out is extraordinarily difficult. The step-down program exists, but the timeline is measured in years and the criteria are subjective. An inmate who spent 20 years in isolation doesn't have 20 years of recent behavior in less restrictive settings to demonstrate they're no longer a threat. The human rights organizations that monitor American prisons, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, unanimously condemn long-term isolation. They argue that no crime justifies this level of psychological torture, that the practice violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Courts have generally disagreed. Federal judges have upheld Supermax isolation as constitutionally permissible when applied to inmates who pose ongoing security threats. The legal standard asks whether the conditions shock the conscience or serve no legitimate penological purpose. By those metrics, ADX survives judicial scrutiny. But legal doesn't mean ethical, and constitutional doesn't mean humane. The correctional officers who work these facilities see the human cost daily. Former Warden Robert Hood's transformation from administrator to critic reflects what happens when you witness the system's effects long enough. The theoretical justifications for Supermax make sense in policy meetings. They make less sense when you're watching someone descend into psychosis because they haven't had a conversation in months. The inmates who survive with their minds intact demonstrate extraordinary resilience. But survival shouldn't require extraordinary resilience. The baseline of human dignity shouldn't be set at didn't completely break under conditions designed to break you. In 2023, the Marshall Project published an investigation into deaths at ADX Florence. Since the facility opened in 1994, 47 inmates had died there. 17 were suicides. Another 12 died from medical conditions that family members claimed were inadequately treated due to security restrictions on inmate movement. Each death represents a failure point in a system that promises to keep people alive while destroying their will to live. The contradiction is fundamental and possibly irresolvable. How do you incapacitate someone completely without annihilating their humanity? How do you isolate someone for public safety without driving them insane? The architects who designed ADX intended it as the ultimate expression of control. Every element engineered to prevent escape, prevent violence, prevent communication. They succeeded in those goals. ADX has never had an escape. Violence against staff is extremely rare. Inmates are almost completely isolated from each other in the outside world. But they also created something else, a place where time stops, where human beings exist in suspended animation, neither living nor dying, just enduring. For the 340 men currently held there, the question of whether ADX should exist is academic. It does exist. They're in it. And for most, they'll remain in it until they die or until policies change, whichever comes first. The outside world rarely thinks about Supermax prisons. ADX Florence sits in the Colorado high desert, invisible to everyone except the staff who work there and the families who visit. Out of sight, out of mind, which is exactly the point. America created these facilities to warehouse people too dangerous to manage through traditional incarceration, to remove them so completely from society that they effectively cease to exist. The system works if your definition of working is they can't hurt anyone anymore. But at what cost? And who pays it? The inmates pay with their sanity. Their families pay with decades of loss. The correctional staff pay with psychological trauma from administering a system many privately question. And society pays with the knowledge that we've created clean, well-lit dungeons for the worst among us and called it justice. There are no easy answers. Some people commit acts so horrific that permanent separation from society seems like the only reasonable response. Some inmates have killed so many times in so many facilities that isolation appears to be the only option that protects staff and other prisoners. But knowing that something seems necessary doesn't make it right. It just makes it a choice we've decided we can live with. The question that remains is whether we should. The steel door closes one final time. The sound echoes down the corridor and fades into silence. Inside the cell, an inmate sits on a concrete bed in a concrete room, counting hours until the next meal arrives through a slot in a steel door. This is America's Supermax system. This is what we've built to contain our most dangerous criminals. This is survival against all odds, not just for the inmates fighting to maintain their sanity, but for a society wrestling with how to balance security, punishment, and basic human dignity. Some of the men in these facilities will never leave. Others might eventually earn transfers to less restrictive housing after years of proving they're no longer threats. But all of them live with the same reality: concrete walls, steel doors, and isolation so complete it can break the human mind. The debate over whether Supermax prisons serve legitimate purposes or constitute cruel and unusual punishment continues in courts, in legislatures, and in the offices of human rights organizations. The inmates themselves don't have the luxury of debating. They just have to survive, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, in a 7 by 12-foot cell that might be their entire world for decades. That's the reality of maximum security. That's what survival looks like when you're locked in the most restrictive facilities America has ever built. If you want to learn more about the American prison system and how mass incarceration affects millions of lives, check out our video on the economics of prison labor, modern slavery in American corrections. It's a deep dive into another dark corner of a system that most people never see. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching. These stories matter. These realities need to be understood. Drop a comment with your thoughts on Supermax prisons and long-term isolation. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation into the hidden corners of the criminal justice system. Until next time, remember, justice is complicated. The truth is uncomfortable, but both demand our attention.